All right, guys, let's talk about succession. Now, succession, by definition, is the gradual replacement of one plant community by another. Okay? And if we always look at the plants, because plants, that starts the bottom of my food chain. And so no other organisms can live in an area unless I have a plant community there. Now, succession, I have two types. I have primary or I have secondary succession. So primary succession means I begin with no soil. There's not 1 ounce of soil here. So like lava flowing through an area or a flood can bring stuff down to bare rock. And so what happens is, if I kind of draw, if you look at the steps and then I draw a picture down here, here's step 1. So here's my bare rock, right? And now that I have my bare rock, I can actually have something called a pioneer species come in. Now, pioneer species are lichens and mosses. They actually don't have a root system, okay? These organisms make soil. And so if I have these lichens and moss growing on this bare rock, what they do is they have things, they look like roots, but they're not really roots. They're just tiny little projectiles, essentially. But those things are going to grow into the crevices of that rock, okay? And when those things grow inside the crevice of the rock, they're going to break that rock down and make it more fine so it's not crazy solid. Then what happens when they do that, these lichens and these mosses, they start to die. And when they start to die, and that mixes with my organic or with my tiny little pebbles, that's what soil's made out of. And so when those start to die, then that leaves a small layer of soil. And so now that I have that small layer of soil, I can have other things come in, like some grasses and maybe some ferns, right? Say they're not very big plants, so they don't need a lot of soil. But what's going to happen, to these organisms is that these organisms, my grasses and my ferns, they're also going to start to die. And when they start to die, that's going to add to my soil level. So now my soil level is going to get a little thicker. And when my soil level gets a little thicker, then I can start having shrubs move in. I can have bigger plants, right? And so now that those bigger plants move in, guess what? Those suckers, they're going to die. And when they die, that also adds to the soil level. So now my soil level is getting actually pretty thick. And when he gets pretty thick, now I can start having trees move in, right? And so I started with bare rock, but then as those organisms break the rock apart by their little tendrils and they die, that produces soil. Then when that soil starts to grow or starts to become more, then I can get bigger and bigger organisms here. That's what this is. This is step 4. This is my climax community. It's a stable group of plants at the end of succession. So now I went from nothing and I can have trees growing. That's a climax community. Or we can look at secondary succession. Secondary succession starts with soil, okay? It begins with soil. So I don't have to worry about breaking up bare rock. I already have soil in place. And now that I have soil in place, like this would be like plowing a field, right? We all live here in Missouri. We've all seen a field being plowed. And so that just takes it down to the soil level. And so I can have these grasses and these ferns come in, okay? So I've already skipped, this is just a different pioneer species. So when they come in, we already know that those things are going to live and they're going to die. And when they die, that adds to my soil level. And so now my soil level is thicker and I can have these shrubs and these bushes start to grow, right? And now that I have my shrubs and bushes starting to grow, I can go to my next step, because then those suckers are going to die. And when they die, that's going to add to my soil level. And now that my soil level is nice and thick, I can support bigger and bigger plant life. And so this could be my trees. That could be my climax community. Now, one thing about climax communities, though, is that it doesn't always really mean big trees, right? If you think about a desert, like here's my desert, I'm not looking at big trees, but I'm going to look at a cactus, right? But when cactuses can grow in an area, then that's going to be the climax community. Or it's the same thing around us when we start looking at prairies. Prairies aren't always filled with big trees. Sometimes they're just filled with grasses. But whatever that end community is, that's the climax community. But big difference between the successional groups is primary begins with no soil, so that'd be like your lava and your floods. You start with a pioneer species that's going to make the soil, and then as plants live and die in that area, they'll add to the soil content until you get to the climax community. Versus secondary succession. Secondary succession is when I start with soil, like a forest fire or plowing a field, my pioneer species are now the grasses and ferns, but when those plants live and die, they add to the soil level until I get to my climax community. All right, I hope that helps.